He thought he'd lost his daughter forever, until a poor orphan girl pointed at her portrait and whispered, "She was my friend." Graham Weston's mansion sat high above the city, a quiet glass fortress suspended between steel and sky. From the outside it looked magnificent, the kind of house people whispered about and pointed to when driving past. Inside, however, the silence was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't rest but lingers, pressing against the walls like a memory that refuses to fade. Tall windows let in morning light that fell in long pale stripes across the marble floor, but even sunlight seemed muted here, as though it too understood that this was not a place of laughter or warmth. It had not been for 2 years. Every room bore a sense of emptiness, not because they were unused but because they once held something precious that had vanished. In the main hall hung a portrait of a little girl, 4 years old, brown hair tied neatly with a red ribbon, dressed in a white blouse and black dress. Her eyes shone with innocence and mischief, caught forever in that painted moment. The brush strokes of her smile were delicate, almost tender. Her name was Amelia. She had disappeared without explanation 2 years ago during what should have been an ordinary day. There had been searches, posters, private investigators, donations, news interviews, desperate pleas, and sleepless nights. But eventually, the world moved on. Only Graham did not. He woke each morning with the same hollow ache, as if part of his chest was missing. People told him time heals, that wounds soften, that grief fades in slow degrees. But in his experience, grief simply learned to hide, waiting for quiet moments to strike. Graham dressed each day in a blue suit, its fabric crisp and precise, as though order and structure could hold him together. His hair was dark and always perfectly in place, his blue eyes sharp yet empty. He carried himself with the posture of a man whose reputation mattered, whose image had weight in the world. But anyone who looked closely enough would see a tiredness in the shape of his mouth, a heaviness in his steps. He was a man who continued breathing because breathing required no permission. His mansion staff worked softly, respectfully, careful never to speak too loudly or linger too long. They had seen their employer's heart break in slow motion, seen the carefully constructed composure he used to keep from falling apart. They never spoke of the portrait. They avoided looking at it for too long. The house had become something like a museum of memory, beautiful, curated, but unbearably still. One morning, his assistant informed him that a child from the local orphanage would be visiting as part of a sponsorship program. The idea had been arranged months ago, a philanthropic gesture recommended by his public relations team. Graham had agreed without thinking. He did not refuse anything related to children anymore. He did not have the strength to. When the girl arrived, she stood very quietly near the entrance of the hall. Her dress was clean but worn, white cotton with slightly frayed stitching, the fabric thinning at the sleeves. She looked small in the vastness of the foyer. Her hair was flaxen blonde, long and fine, her blue eyes wide and cautious, the eyes of someone who had learned how to observe before speaking. She held her hands folded in front of her, not fidgeting, not moving, as though fearing she might break something simply by existing too close to it. Her name was Lily. Graham glanced at her with polite acknowledgement, the kind he reserved for strangers, the kind that required no true attention. He was prepared to offer her a tour, a donation to her orphanage, perhaps a gentle conversation if necessary. But Lily did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the portrait hanging above the grand staircase. It was subtle at first, just a stillness in her posture. Then her breathing changed, becoming shallow, uneven. She stepped closer to the painting, her small face lifting slowly. Her lips parted, and a tremor rippled faintly through her expression, one that did not belong to curiosity, but to recognition. Graham's heart gave a slow, painful jolt, though he did not yet know why. Lily reached out and touched the wooden frame gently, almost reverently, as if touching something sacred. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but her words carried through the hall with startling clarity. "Sir, this girl, she was my friend at the orphanage. The silence that followed did not simply return. It crashed. Like a wave breaking. Like breath stopping. Graham felt the world tilt, not violently, but with a slow and devastating pull, as though everything he believed had just shifted into something unrecognizable. The house had been quiet for years. But now the silence was different. It was waiting. Graham did not understand at first. His mind tried to rearrange Lily's words into something else, something harmless, something that would not reopen every wound he had forced himself to seal. The hall seemed to close in, and the portrait, once just a reminder of loss, now felt like a question painted onto the wall. He stepped closer, slowly, as though movement itself had become heavy, as though the floor might crack beneath him. Lily stood perfectly still, her hand remaining on the frame as if she needed its support. "What did you say?" Graham asked at last, but the words came out rough, uneven, as if scraped out of his throat rather than spoken. He was a man known for calm, for measured tone and calculated pauses. But now his voice betrayed him. Lily turned to look at him, and her blue eyes seemed older than they should have been, eyes that had seen and understood more than a 6-year-old should ever need to. She did not flinch under his gaze, but neither did she seem proud or eager to share what she knew. She simply carried the truth as one carries a burden. "I knew her," Lily said quietly. "Her name was Mia. She slept in the bed next to mine. She took a breath that shivered faintly in her chest. She cried at night. She missed her dad." Graham's heart stuttered painfully against his ribs. Amelia had always called him Daddy. Mia. A nickname. A piece of her that still lived somewhere. Lily continued, not noticing the way his hands had begun to tremble. "She told me she had a daddy who loved her very much and that she didn't know why she was taken away. She said she used to live in a big house with windows like this one." Lily lifted her chin, her gaze flicking to the tall windows around them. "She said she tried to remember your voice so she wouldn't forget." The room grew impossibly still. Graham's breath did not come. The ache in his chest sharpened into something almost unendurable. For months after Amelia vanished, he had believed she must be close enough to feel him searching. He had called her name into empty rooms, certain she could hear him. He had whispered to her in dreams, begging the world to return her. And all this time, while his house remained silent, she had been crying in a place where no one reached her. "How long ago?" he asked, though the words barely formed. Lily's expression changed, something like sadness, but shaped by memory rather than emotion. "I think about 1 year. Maybe more." She pressed her fingers to her dress, gripping the fabric lightly, grounding herself. She had a red ribbon. She liked to braid it in her hair. She said her dad tied it for her every morning. The ribbon. He remembered tying it. His hands had learned the motion by heart. Graham looked up at the portrait again, and everything inside him ached. Not just grief anymore. Something sharper. Shock. Hope. Terror. Because if Lily was telling the truth, Amelia had not simply vanished into the world. She had been moved. Placed. Hidden. Taken. "Where?" he asked, though the question felt like a plea rather than a demand. Lily's voice stayed calm and steady, though her eyes softened with something like apology. "The orphanage where I lived before." She took another slow breath. But she didn't stay long. One day a woman came. She spoke to the director. She signed papers. And then Mia was gone. She didn't get to say goodbye. She just looked at me through the car window. And she cried again. There are moments when sound becomes memory. The ticking of the clock. The hum of the air. The soft distant rustle of trees outside. All of it became painfully clear as Graham stood there, his world rearranging itself one fractured piece at a time. His assistant entered the hall just then, beginning to speak, but froze when she saw his expression. She had seen him devastated before, on the day Amelia disappeared, but this was different. This was controlled breaking. Shattering with purpose. "Find the director of that orphanage," Graham said, his voice low but iron-hard now. "Now. And call Harris. Tell him to reopen every file." His assistant hesitated only a second before hurrying away. Lily still stood near the portrait, her small shoulders drawn inward slightly, as though unsure what came next. Graham looked at her, not as a visitor, not as a charity case, but as the child who held the thread leading back to his daughter. "Lily," he said softly. She looked up. "You did the right thing by telling me." Lily nodded once, but her expression didn't brighten. "She was my friend," she said. "And she missed you every day." That was when the silence in the house finally changed. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the breath before a storm. Graham did not sleep that night. The mansion, usually silent in a numb and distant way, now felt alive with tension. Every light seemed too bright. Every shadow seemed to be holding its breath. He stood in his study, hands braced on the edge of the desk, staring at files that had once been closed and buried. 2 years of reports, interviews, statements, leads that went nowhere. The pages had yellowed slightly at the corners from being looked through too many times, hope rubbed thin by repetition. Yet now, with Lily's words echoing in his mind, each document felt different, as if they had been written in a language he hadn't understood until now. Lily had been taken to the guest room to rest. She hadn't cried once. But her silence was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of someone who had learned early that crying did not bring adults running, that pain was something to be held privately. When the housekeeper tried to give her a blanket, she thanked her with a politeness that belonged to someone much older, and then sat on the edge of the bed as though she was afraid to disturb the sheets. She sat like someone who expected things to be taken away the moment she relaxed. Graham saw that from the doorway before he left her to sleep. It stung him somewhere deep, in a place he had ignored for too long. His investigator, Harris, arrived just after dawn. He was a man with sharp eyes and a steady manner, the kind of person who was not easily shaken. Yet when Graham relayed Lily's story, Harris's expression shifted. Not surprise, he had seen too many terrible things to be surprised, but recognition. A quiet understanding that some truths, once revealed, demand movement. "We'll start with the orphanage records," Harris said. "If the child was there, there will be paperwork. Even if they tried to cover it." Graham nodded, though his jaw was clenched so tightly it hurt. "She said Amelia, Mia, was taken by a woman. Someone signed for her." Harris folded his arms. Illegal private adoption rings sometimes use orphanages as fronts. It would explain how the trail went cold so quickly. The words felt like acid. Graham had spent 2 years believing Amelia might have wandered, been lost, been hidden, been kept somewhere unclear. But the idea that she had been processed, handed off, documented, that someone had looked at her crying and signed a paper to make it legal, burned. He grabbed his coat before Harris could say anything else. "We're going." The orphanage was nothing like his home. The paint on the gates was peeling, the playground rusted, the windows clouded with fingerprints and age. Children's voices echoed from somewhere inside, some playful, some tired. Childhood here was not a soft place. It was something to be survived. The director, a woman named Mrs. Calder, met them in her office. Her smile was polite, but her eyes darted nervously when Graham mentioned Amelia's name. She tried to act confused, then tried to pretend she didn't recognize the description, then insisted records were private. But Harris was patient and relentless. He began asking questions she did not expect, names of sponsors, visitation logs, transfer papers. Every time she shifted in her chair, every time she swallowed, every time her hands trembled on her desk, her guilt tightened the room. Finally, Graham spoke, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. "My daughter was here," he said quietly. "Someone took her. And you let it happen." Mrs. Calder's breath hitched. Her face crumpled, not from sympathy, but fear. "I didn't choose where she went," she said quickly. "I didn't decide who she belonged to. They said." Graham stepped closer, his voice low and shaking. "Who?" There was a moment, a painful, suspended moment, where the truth hovered, trembling, refusing to remain hidden any longer. Mrs. Calder's voice came out barely audible. "The adoption was arranged through a private agency. They said it was for a wealthy family out of state. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want trouble. We never want trouble." Graham closed his eyes. He felt the world go very still again. But this time, the stillness was not paralysis. It was focus. He exhaled through his teeth. "You're going to give me every document. Every name. Every date. Every transfer. And you're going to do it now. Because I am going to find her." Mrs. Calder nodded, hands shaking so violently the keys jingled on her desk. As the files were brought out, thin folders with too few pages, names handwritten hurriedly, dates that didn't align, Lily's role in all of it came into sharper clarity. She was not just a witness. She was the one who had carried Amelia's memory when the world had erased her. A child who had remembered another child when no one else had. On the drive back, Graham's hands shook on the steering wheel. He had spent 2 years drowning in grief. Now grief had turned into direction. It was the first time since Amelia disappeared that he was moving toward her instead of away from the memory of her loss. And the storm inside him was no longer sorrow. It was purpose. The atmosphere in the mansion changed completely over the next few days. What had once been a silent, museum-like space now pulsed with tension, urgency, and the constant movement of people and information. Harris worked from the study, stacks of documents spread across the polished wood table, phones ringing with new leads, old names resurfacing, dead ends re-examined. Every hour someone called with something, a record found, a signed form located, a blurry security photo retrieved from storage. Graham hovered near the windows, always standing rather than sitting, his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders tight, his gaze distant and hard. He didn't speak much, but his silence now was filled with direction rather than emptiness. Lily moved quietly through the house, though she no longer seemed intimidated by its size. She watched the adults carefully, studying every expression, every word. Children who grow up without stability learn to read people the way others read books, learning to predict danger before it arrives. She never asked if Amelia would be found. She simply waited with a quiet, unwavering certainty, as though she had already seen the ending, even if she didn't know when it would come. Sometimes Graham found her sitting beneath the portrait in the evenings, her small knees drawn close to her chest, her eyes tracing the brushstrokes that formed Amelia's face. She didn't touch the frame this time. She simply sat with it, as though keeping the girl in the painting company. Once, he sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to be present. She didn't look at him, and he didn't speak. They sat like that for a long time, the silence shared instead of endured. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. A name. A signature. A woman who had posed as a private adoption facilitator. She had received children from underfunded orphanages and transferred them to buyers, wealthy families who didn't want to wait for legal channels. It was illegal, but difficult to trace because the paperwork disguised the children's identities. But one detail was unmistakable: Amelia had been taken under the false name Mia Garner. The woman's last known address was in a quiet rural area 2 hours outside the city, a place surrounded by tall pines and old farmland. The type of place where secrets could sit for years without being disturbed. Graham didn't hesitate. He ordered the car, and when Lily saw him preparing to leave, she stood from the staircase and walked toward him with silent determination. "You can't come," he said gently. She didn't cry, didn't argue, but her hands tightened into small fists at her sides. Her voice was steady, but very small. "If you find her and she's scared, someone she knows should be there." Those words hit him with a force he did not expect. He realized Amelia might not remember him the way he remembered her. But she would remember Lily. After a long moment, he nodded. The drive was quiet. Pine trees lined the road, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the sun seemed pale, hidden behind thin clouds. The house they arrived at was old, the porch sagging, the paint worn down to gray. A swing hung crookedly from the front beam, creaking softly when the wind passed. It looked like a place where voices were kept low, where doors were always locked from the inside, where children learned quickly which rooms they were allowed to enter and which ones they weren't. Harris approached first, his knock firm but not aggressive. A woman in her 40s opened the door. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes flicked between Graham, Harris, and Lily with calculated caution. She tried to speak, tried to smile, even, but when Graham spoke Amelia's false name, the smile cracked. Her face changed. Not into guilt. Into fear. She ran. Not far. Not fast. Harris caught her easily just outside the porch.